Coming up, the decline of agency incentives. Hello and welcome to IDCOM's Media Snack, episode 79. So as you'll see, David and I are in different parts of the world again. I'm attending the ANA's Advertising Financial Management Conference, and we'll be giving you some insight of what's going on here.
And I'm back in London, and we're going to review P&G's appointment to Publicis Media in the UK.
Yeah, all coming up on Media Snack in just the time it takes to eat a sandwich. Okay, so if you've been watching the last couple of episodes, you'll know that we've been counting down the weeks to the anniversary, the first anniversary of the ANA's Media Transparency Report, which, as you'll remember, sent somewhat shockwaves through the industry last year. We've looked at media transparency as a theme, and we're really trying to focus on things that we think have changed significantly in the last 12 months. So we looked at media transparency, we looked at media talent last week, if you remember, and this week we're going to focus on media terms, which is things like payment models and terms of business with agencies.
Yeah, and Tom, you're in San Diego at the moment, actually attending an ANA conference, right? This is the Financial Management Conference. That's a very snazzy badge you've got there. So the Financial Management Conference for the ANA, for those of us that haven't actually attended, what's that about, and who's that addressing in particular?
Well, it's 4 days of hardcore procurement, marketing procurement. You know, so kind of worth flying 11 hours to get here. It is, but it's a really big conference. The ANA, they run dozens of events across the year. The Advertising Financial Management is their big procurement-focused conference. It's kind of one of the top-tier events that they do. I think there's about 800 people. Yeah, I think this is my 5th year. I've been coming for a long time, and it's really helpful just to get a sense of how the procurement community in the US are viewing agencies, particularly, and how they're working through so much like disruption and change in the industry. They're having to really kind of keep on their toes.
Now that is actually really interesting. And so you're going into day 2. You attended day 1 yesterday. What was the kind of the key presentation, the key theme of yesterday's session?
Well, yeah. So the first day they call the pre-conference first day, and that's where they share updates on either big ANA initiatives or pieces of research. And yesterday they revealed the results of their latest piece of research they've been doing into agency compensation, they call it, which is kind of payment models and remuneration. This is something they conduct for some reason. Well, they've been running it about 50 years, so this was number 17, and they run it every 3 years, which I guess it's a lot of work. But you know, payment models change. It's such a dynamic part of the business. That there's a bit of a lag, I think, on a 3-year. But anyway, yesterday was an update, and so I was really kind of keen to understand that, given the focus that we've been placing and the importance on how you set up agency payment models dictates entirely the performance of the agency and the kind of quality of the service that you're going to get.
Yeah, but I mean, all the more important and interesting that the audience is predominantly procurement, right? I mean, Mark Pritchard, a brand marketeer, talked about the importance of paying his agencies fairly. An unprofitable agency is bad for business, he said. But the ANA were preaching to the procurement community. What was the kind of message that came out, the key headlines from the findings?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting you reference Mark there, because he said that agencies should be paid fairly, and that's kind of P&G's line. Some might argue that the people in the room here are the ones that perhaps have been guilty of paying unfairly or of kind of driving costs down, which, depending on who you believe, may be one of the big contributing factors to a lot of the issues raised in the ANA's transparency findings. So there's a lot of interest and attention here. The way that they present the findings kind of splits down into these 3 areas. So there's looking at different methods of compensation. So they ask, what are the most popular methods? The use of performance incentives, which was really an interesting one, and also how compensation models are being managed. So if we just look at those three, they've been quite well reported actually already. But the kind of big headline that was out there, you've probably seen, is that it's the rebirth or the bounce back of commission as a payment model, which seemed to pick up a lot of headlines. But actually, looking into the data of that yesterday, that's just not really the case. There's been a growth in commission payment, but from a small base. I think it's gone from like 17 to 12, or 7 to 12% or something.
Yeah, that's right.
And really, that can be attributed to just ways of paying for programmatic buying. I don't think that's an indication that there's huge dissatisfaction with existing kind of fee-based models. And bear in mind as well, this is not just media, right? This is all marketing services, all kind of lumped together in one study every 3 years. So it's not forensically accurate.
Yeah. And from the findings that I've seen for the last kind of 4 or 5 studies, the majority of the respondents talked about paying their agencies predominantly through a fee-based structure. But there's been a decline, hasn't there, in the amount of respondents that are suggesting that that's the way that they pay their agencies?
Well, a little bit. I mean, there's been small movements. At that level, we talk about typical models of payment. I mean, there's been a bit of an uptick on commission payment, a little bit of a down on fee, and value-based compensation, which is something that we advocate strongly to a lot of clients that we work with. It didn't even show up in the last 2 surveys. So for the last 6 years, when value-based compensation was supposed to be growing, it didn't even register. And then this year, it now counts, I think, for 7% of all payment models. So that's good to see that that's progress. But as they admit, 86 members in the US is not necessarily representative. Perhaps of those more innovative marketers, maybe are not willing to kind of share the details.
So what conclusions are the ANA coming back to the conference with? I mean, they've conducted this survey. What direction are they providing to the members?
Well, I think that's a bit of a gap, actually. So they present the data, but there aren't any really clear guidelines, and I think it's needed. I think this procurement community, who really, really need to understand the impact that a good payment model has. Yeah. And then it's not a blunt lever for negotiating downwards. And maybe that's not giving enough credit to procurement or more kind of nuanced procurement expertise. But that has been a trend. Is the downward level of income paid to agencies. And the way that you set up, particularly when it comes to talking about incentive payments, the way that you calibrate that to your needs is really critical. So, one of the headlines coming out of the report was that incentive payments don't work. But again, that was a small proportion of people that had actually said that. And the likelihood is that if your incentive payment is not working, it doesn't mean that incentive payments are wrong. It just means that you haven't set it up properly. It's clearly not incentivizing the right behavior. Yeah. So that needs to be looked at. So there may be some people implementing performance-based models without necessarily really understanding the behaviors that they're trying to incentivize, because that's really what it's designed to do. I mean, we say a lot, I think we've said it a few times on the show, what gets measured gets done. Everybody knows that old adage. But what gets paid for gets done first. And so an agency, any partner, supplier, anybody externally, how you pay them and how you reward them completely dictates the level of service that you get and where they will start and where they will focus their energy.
That's right. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the one kind of positive that I took from reading the report earlier today was that the level of senior management involvement in engaging with their agencies around remuneration has significantly increased from about 30% to 80%. So at least senior stakeholder involvement is being kind of invested in that kind of discussion, which is absolutely critical, isn't it?
I think it's good, and to me that's a good indication and this is one of the things, we come back to the theme of what we're talking about, which is, a countdown to the ANA's transparency report anniversary. What's the impact that that's had? I think what you just mentioned, which is more senior attention to relationships with external partners, and also the financial models underlying that, I think is absolutely related to the greater scrutiny and accountability of media. And of course that was largely triggered, I think, by the report from last year. So that, I totally agree. I think that's really encouraging. And to me, it suggests that when we think about media, this is an industry which is increasingly now seeing media as an investment in something, and therefore anyone in the media supply chain needs to be held to greater account and should be incentivized for good performance. I think it's just good practice. I'm surprised there's not more, still not more incentive-based payment going on.
Yeah, I agree. And whilst that was a highlight, one of the most surprising things that I found from the report, and I still can't believe that this is true, so I may have misread it, but it suggested that only 50% of the 89 marketeers or brands that had responded to the survey were aware of the ANA transparency report that was published last year. Surely not half of the people that had responded to this survey were unaware of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was it was mentioned casually because obviously that was a question that had been asked. I mean, one of the things they'd done differently on the survey this year, having not done it for 3 years, was to also ask questions about how behavior and sentiment had changed in light of the transparency reporting from last year. So that was an additional component of this reporting. And so of that, in the course of that, they'd obviously asked respondents to what extent they knew about the ANA's transparency report and if that was affecting their thinking. But it so flagged up this alarming statistic, which frankly, after all of the data that they'd shared yesterday afternoon, was the only thing that people were talking about as we kind of all left the conference at the end of the day, was that 50% of respondents said they hadn't even heard of the ANA's media transparency report, which is just absolutely astonishing. Maybe 50% may not have read it or implemented it or care too much about it perhaps, but not to have even heard about it.
That's shocking.
Is really worrying, and at the same time that person is obviously taking the time to fill in an ANA survey on payment models. So it's just not registering for some reason.
You raised that as a question, did you?
Yeah, I did. I asked a question just to what they thought the implications of that or the cause of that would be, and the suggestion offered up was that marketers in the last year have faced many challenges, and that was one of a number of priorities, and that we expect the number 50% to grow. Well, you'd hope so.
And so we've got a result on the P&G European Media Review.
Yeah, which is great. And we've been talking just now about Mark Pritchard, and we've spoken a lot about his speeches and their declaration that they want to create new ways of working with agencies and pay them fairly. So this has been long anticipated, just to see where that would net out.
Yeah, that's right. So this was, I think, a review that launched at the back end of last year. P&G spend about £210 million a year just in the UK. I think with the exception of Sky, they're the second biggest advertiser in the UK. Starcom was the incumbent, and they've retained the business. So actually, they've consolidated the business. They've secured more business and taken print, I think, away from Mediacom. So it's an enormous result for Publicis Media. Ian Jacobs and Steve King will be absolutely delighted for that. But obviously, the implications of that result on the other agencies that were competing for that piece of business will be significant also. So you had Dentsu were in the mix. Mediacom have lost a bit of business, but I think probably the biggest loser of all of it will be Hearts and Science. So this, if you remember, was an agency that was established in the US, an Omnicom agency based around the P&G pitch brief in the US. And kind of that was their founding client, right? And then they launched that business in the UK to pretty great fanfare. Obviously in line with the P&G process and review, but unfortunately they've been unsuccessful this time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in Europe, I mean, this was a pan-European review. There were questions as to whether this might consolidate into one. It hasn't happened. So the markets are still somewhat fragmented. Group M retain kind of a lot of the big kind of German-speaking markets. Publicis Media have consolidated in the UK. Hearts and Science, I think, was the only non-incumbent, but I think for them, this must feel like quite a catastrophic loss of a client. As you say, given the expectation was that they were exporting and expanding the Hearts and Science model outside of the US, and they've been busy kind of building that out as a network. But this was the first real big test outside of the US, and I think that will be felt like somewhat of a blow because it calls into question maybe the validity of that model. It was developed for P&G. Why would they not want to buy it in Europe? Maybe the agency's not ready. Maybe they didn't have the right people in the right places. But I think that had they landed this, you would have felt, wow, Hearts and Science really is an unstoppable new kind of generation of agency. I'm sure all the other agency groups will be delighted that maybe that's been kind of knocked back at this stage anyway.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Hearts and Science react to this, how they dust themselves off from what will invariably be a blow, and then just get themselves back into the pitch market and secure some of their business. Whilst it won't be quite as high profile and as significant as the P&G business, I'm sure they're going to make sure that they're a player certainly in the UK market. Yeah.
And P&G notoriously kind of keep their cards close to their chest, apart from when Mark's out on doing his keynote. So it may take some time before we understand maybe some of the implications of his pay agencies fairly. And hopefully this wasn't a case of agencies racing to the bottom on fees and costs, and that this is really about building effective marketing. So congratulations to Publicis Media. They've obviously kind of nailed that brief.
Absolutely.
I mean, there hasn't been a huge amount of movement, to be honest, though, on the roster, and I think that's somewhat as well indicative. Just the scale of P&G, to move business from one agency to another is a huge undertaking at that scale as well. So there's a lot of inbuilt resistance to change. But I understand they had an incredibly long, protracted, and very thorough evaluation process of the agencies. So I'm sure Publicis have won it on the upside, not on the downside, I hope.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's all for this week from an increasingly sunny San Diego. Bye for now.
From London, have a good weekend.